The moment the judge paused on a single transaction line, the entire courtroom shifted. Because suddenly, this wasn't a divorce case anymore. 8:40 in the morning was the kind of time that made everything look normal even when it wasn't. The light in the kitchen was soft, filtered through the blinds in thin horizontal lines. I noticed how evenly they cut across the table. I also noticed how still everything felt before anything was said or done. The papers were already there when I walked in. Not scattered, not rushed. Placed with intention, aligned almost perfectly with the edge of the table. That kind of precision didn't come from hesitation. It came from preparation that had already passed its emotional stage. I registered that before I even fully processed what the documents were. The house in North Chicago carried its usual morning silence. Same sound of distant traffic. Same hum from the refrigerator. Nothing in the environment suggested rupture. That contrast stayed with me longer than it should have. Because inside that calm layout, something had already shifted into a final state. I looked at the documents without touching them at first. Divorce papers. Formally prepared. Legal structure already in place. My name, her name, signatures waiting in clean empty spaces. No visible hesitation in the formatting, as if the outcome had been decided somewhere outside this room. I noticed how efficiently it had been done. That efficiency told me more than the content. I set my coffee down slowly, not because I was surprised, but because I needed the surface cleared. A small action that created space where there had been none a second earlier. The sound of the cup against the table was sharper than expected. It cut through the kitchen like something misplaced. I read nothing in a linear way. My eyes moved across sections, then back again, not searching for meaning, but confirming structure. Everything was already complete. There were no missing parts, no visible negotiation points. That absence of friction was its own message, and I understood it faster than I expected to. She stood on the other side of the table, watching without moving. Her presence wasn't emotional in the way these moments usually are described. It was controlled, positioned, almost rehearsed into stillness. I registered that contrast too. The stillness on both sides of the table did not match in intent. I expected something else to happen at that point, a delay, a correction, a sign that this was still reversible or at least open to discussion. Nothing like that appeared. Instead, there was only continuation of the same controlled sequence. Papers, table, silence, breath, observation. I signed where it was required. Not quickly, not slowly. The motion itself felt detached from the meaning attached to it. The pen moved across the paper with a kind of ease that usually belongs to decisions made long before the moment of execution. I noticed that detail and did not ignore it. When I placed the pen down, nothing changed in the room. No visible relief. No visible reaction. That absence became its own form of pressure. I became aware that I was not being pulled into an emotional exchange. I was being observed for consistency. At that point, I understood something without it being stated. The assumption that this moment would generate resistance had already existed on one side of the table. It was wrong. That mismatch created a gap between expectation and outcome that didn't close. And in that gap, I noticed the first real uncertainty. Not about the divorce itself, about why it had been expected to unfold differently. 6 days passed without any visible break in the surface. The court filing in Cook County moved through the system exactly as expected. No delays, no exceptions, the kind of administrative flow that creates the illusion of order. I noted the precision of it, because nothing else around me had that quality anymore. Everything else was starting to feel slightly misaligned. Emily did not wait for the legal rhythm to catch up with her actions. She moved ahead of it. Assets were being redistributed before formal approval cycles completed. Accounts adjusted. Ownership percentages shifted in documents that I had not been shown before they were executed. The speed itself was the first irregularity I registered. I accessed the joint accounts in the mornings, usually before 8 o'clock. The interface looked unchanged. Same structure, same categories. But the content inside those categories began to drift. Small transfers at first. Amounts that did not stand out individually. They only became visible when viewed together, as a sequence rather than isolated events. 14/3, 1827, 9/11 the next day. I recorded each timestamp manually. Not because I needed proof immediately, but because repetition creates structure where instinct does not yet have one. The pattern was not obvious at first glance. It revealed itself only after the fourth and fifth entry aligned in the same directional flow. At first I considered system latency, banking delays, automated reallocations tied to pending legal status. Each explanation failed as more entries appeared. The direction of the funds did not match any standard household distribution model. It was not maintenance, it was movement. I did not contact anyone. I did not flag anything through official channels. Instead, I isolated the data. I removed context and kept only structure, time, amount, destination layer. Once reduced to that level, the behavior stopped looking random. It started looking authored. By the fifth day, I noticed something else. The transfers were not just consistent. They were positioned. Certain hours repeated. Certain intervals returned with minimal variation. That kind of repetition does not occur naturally in financial drift. It suggested planning that operated independently of visible oversight. The question changed at that point. It was no longer what was happening. It became how much of it was supposed to remain invisible. On the seventh day, a discrepancy appeared that could not be aligned with any normal explanation. A set of transactions processed during a window when I had been physically present with her the entire time. No separation, no external access, no device usage that could explain independent authorization. The record showed movement that should not have been possible under shared access conditions. I reviewed the timestamps again, then again. The data did not correct itself under repetition. It remained stable, which meant the error was not in reading it. It was in the system that produced it. That was the first moment I understood there were only two options. Either the records were compromised at a level I had not accounted for, or the assumption of shared financial control had already been invalid long before the papers were placed on the table. Neither option matched the version of events I had been given. And in that mismatch, something opened that had no immediate explanation. 12 days after the divorce filing, the case stopped being a legal process and started behaving like a system under inspection. I noticed it first through the lawyer's request, an expanded financial audit, broader than standard procedure, not limited to joint assets anymore. It extended into structures that usually remain untouched unless there is prior indication of concealment. The wording was procedural, but the implication was not. I reviewed the scope early in the morning, before 8:30. The kitchen light was unchanged, but the documents on the table were not. New layers had been added overnight. Subsections, appendices, external account references that did not belong to any shared household structure I had ever seen. The first irregularity was not the accounts themselves. It was their existence. They were not listed in any prior disclosures. Not in tax filings I had signed. Not in financial summaries I had reviewed during the marriage. Yet they were active, funded, and structured with operational continuity that suggested long-term maintenance. I traced one of the pathways manually. Funds moved through intermediate entities before reaching investment instruments labeled in a way that avoided direct attribution. The architecture was deliberate. Each layer reduced visibility, not value. I recorded everything without interruption. Account names, transfer intervals, institutional identifiers. The pattern was not chaotic. It was segmented, as if different parts of the system had been constructed at different times, then later connected into a single flow. By midday, the structure stopped resembling a household financial system. It looked like a network. A single investment consultant appeared repeatedly across multiple nodes, not as a primary account holder, but as an intermediary point of access, a bridge between structures that should not have been connected in any normal configuration. I checked the association history. It extended further back than the divorce timeline, further back than the filing, further back than any visible trigger event. That was the first displacement. The divorce was no longer the origin point. It had been repositioned inside a process that predated it. I isolated transactions tied to that consultant and rebuilt the sequence manually. The same pattern appeared again. Funds entering through one layer, redistributed through 2 or 3 hidden channels, then resurfacing in instruments that carried no direct link to our shared accounts. Each layer removed ownership visibility but preserved movement continuity. By the third review cycle, I noticed something that did not fit even the constructed logic. Certain entries were dated in a way that contradicted their processing timestamps, backdated execution markers, Financial history written as if it had already occurred before it was recorded. I stopped for a moment, not because of uncertainty, but because the structure required recalibration. Backdating in isolation can indicate correction. Backdating across multiple independent channels indicates authorization from a system level above normal account access. I checked access logs again. Then again. Nothing in the visible permissions explained it. No shared credentials. No authorized delegation recorded within the expected time window. And yet the system behaved as if someone had already been inside it long before the audit began. That was the second displacement. The assumption of timing collapsed. I marked each anomalous entry and aligned them against physical presence data, communication logs, and known joint activity periods. Some of the transactions aligned with moments where I had been directly present, in shared spaces, with no separation that could explain independent execution. The contradiction did not resolve. It stabilized, which meant it was not an error. It was a condition. By late evening, I stopped treating it as a financial discrepancy and started treating it as a constructed environment with hidden access layers. The question was no longer what had been moved. It was who had been able to move it before visibility existed. And somewhere beneath the surface of that system, I saw the first outline of a structure that had no official entry point at all. 9:15. Cook County Courthouse. I arrived before the corridor filled completely. The building was already awake in its own controlled way. Security checks, paper movement, quiet footsteps that never lasted long enough to echo. Everything was designed to look neutral, but neutrality in a courtroom always meant preparation for something specific. The courtroom itself was standard. Wood panels, glass partitions, a fixed cold light that flattened facial expression into something readable but incomplete. I sat without adjusting anything. The chair was aligned with the table aligned with the floor markers. Even that alignment felt intentional in a way I could not ignore. Emily was already there. She did not look uncertain. That was the first irregularity. People in divorce proceedings usually carried some visible trace of recalculation. She did not. Her posture was fixed, composed, almost prepositioned for outcome rather than discussion. I noted it without reacting to it outwardly. The judge entered with procedural calm. Pages moved slowly. Document stacks were reviewed in a sequence that suggested routine processing. Nothing about the early minutes indicated deviation from standard dissolution review. That changed when the judge paused on a single page longer than expected. The financial report. I recognized it immediately. It was not the summary version. It was the extended movement log, the one that usually remains in audit layer unless explicitly requested. The pause was not dramatic, but it was precise. It marked a separation point in the rhythm of the room. The judge did not turn pages immediately after that. Instead, attention stayed fixed on a single transaction line. I followed the line visually without moving. Large transfer, structured routing, multiple intermediary layers, timestamp during a period marked as jointly restricted authorization. That detail changed the temperature of the room without any physical shift. The process stopped without being formally stopped. There was no announcement, no procedural reset, just a suspension that spread through everyone's posture at different speeds. Even the clerk's movement slowed, as if waiting for confirmation that the system was still operating normally. The question came next, directed at the structure of authorization rather than the people themselves. It was not phrased as accusation. It was phrased as verification of legitimacy. Who had sanctioned the transaction? The silence that followed was not empty. It was measured. I tracked the duration of it without intending to. 1 second. 2. More than enough time for a routine clarification that never arrived. Emily did not respond immediately. That delay became the focal point, not the question, not the document, the absence of immediate correction. I watched her hands remain still. No adjustment of posture, no movement toward papers. That stillness carried more information than any statement could have. I reviewed the timeline internally without looking away from the record in front of me. The transaction in question matched entries I had already flagged outside the courtroom. Same routing structure. Same layered concealment logic. But here it existed inside a judicial review environment that did not treat it as background data anymore. It was now central evidence. The judge's attention did not leave the page. That meant the classification had already shifted internally. from administrative divorce processing to financial anomaly requiring clarification. I registered that shift as irreversible once initiated. At that moment, I understood the case was no longer contained within civil boundaries. The structure around it had expanded without visible transition point. And in that expansion, a new category had quietly entered the room without being named. Not divorce, not dispute. Something closer to financial exposure under investigation conditions that had not yet been fully declared. The first 48 hours did not feel like escalation at the beginning. They felt like correction. I tracked it from a neutral position, without intervening in any visible process. The system around the case began to shift on its own. Not suddenly, but in layers that activated faster than expected. Each layer exposed the instability of the one beneath it. The first signal was banking containment. Accounts tied to shared assets began to freeze in partial segments, not fully closed, not fully operational. Just restricted enough to interrupt flow without collapsing visibility. That kind of restriction usually means external verification is active. I checked timestamps. The restrictions did not occur simultaneously. They followed a sequence. That sequence matched the order in which financial audits had been expanded during the court phase. By morning of the second day, the legal teams stopped operating with procedural confidence. Document exchanges slowed, then restructured. Instead of arguments, there were validations. Instead of positions, there were requests for confirmation of identity layers that previously had not been questioned. That was the first structural fracture. Then the auditors escalated. I reviewed their internal flags without accessing anything directly restricted to me. Duplicate signature detection had been triggered across multiple transaction clusters. The system was not reporting simple mismatch. It was reporting identity collision. My biometric markers did not align with recorded authorizations on several high-value transfers. The mismatch was not marginal. It was absolute in certain cases. That indicated one thing only. Someone had created valid access signatures that replicated authority without being physically tied to me. I isolated the affected entries. The pattern did not behave randomly. The duplicates were not distributed evenly. They clustered around specific time windows. Windows that did not align with my activity logs or known device usage. At that point, the structure stopped resembling fraud detection and started resembling system compromise. By the second evening, the court requested full digital authorization logs. That request changed everything. Authorization logs are not usually escalated unless the validity of the access chain itself is under question. It meant the system no longer trusted the surface-level transaction records. It needed origin-level confirmation. I reviewed the incoming reports as they were compiled. One detail broke the sequence. A subset of transactions had been confirmed using a device registered under Emily's control profile. That alone would not have been unusual. What made it unstable was the discrepancy in location and time. The device was recorded as active in a different geographic region while simultaneously authorizing transactions within the financial system tied to Chicago-based execution points. Two conflicting realities recorded as one continuous authority stream. That should not have been possible without external replication of credentials or layered delegation that bypassed standard authentication logic. The system did not label it as error. It labeled it as valid. That was the second fracture. By the third day, law enforcement from the Economic Crimes Division initiated preliminary review. Not intervention, not charges. Just containment-level observation with access expansion. The structure had reached a threshold where internal explanation was no longer sufficient. I observed the transition without direct engagement. Documents moved faster. Requests for verification became repetitive. Every answer generated two more questions instead of closure. The system was now feeding on its own inconsistencies. I noted the absence of a single stabilizing point. Emily's control no longer appeared complete. That became visible not through her actions, but through the way responses around her began to diverge. Some data streams still referenced her authority. Others bypassed it entirely. That divergence implied fragmentation of control, not centralized manipulation, which raised a different question. If she was not the sole access point, then who had been operating parallel authorization layers long before the court became involved? I traced back through the audit expansion timeline again. Certain permissions predated the divorce filing. Some predated even the financial review window. That meant access had existed in silence, embedded inside the structure long before exposure began. By the end of the 48 hours, the system was visibly degrading under its own verification process, not collapsing, unraveling in controlled segments. And still, the most critical element remained undefined. Not the fraud, not the duplication, but the origin of authority that allowed both to exist without immediate detection. That origin point had not yet surfaced, and its absence was becoming the most precise signal of all. 3 weeks after the first filing, the system stopped behaving like a dispute and started behaving like a case. I arrived at the courthouse at 9:10, earlier than required, but timing no longer mattered in the same way. Everything was already in motion without needing participation. The building felt quieter than before, not because activity had reduced, but because roles had been redefined. The interim ruling was delivered without ceremony. The divorce was suspended, not denied, not approved, held in place until financial investigation reached completion. That distinction mattered more than the outcome itself. Suspension meant the process had been absorbed into something larger than family law. I noted the change in classification as it was read into record. Assets were partially frozen, not all at once. Selective restriction, the kind that preserves structure while preventing movement. It created a system where ownership still existed on paper, but control had been interrupted in practice. That interruption was the real decision. By midday, case materials had been transferred beyond the civil channel. Federal investigators had been assigned review authority under suspected financial fraud conditions. The language used in the transfer was procedural, but the implication was structural. This was no longer about division of property. It was about origin of control. I observed Emily from a distance during the final procedural exit phase. She did not remain in any visible part of the process after the ruling was formalized. Her presence shifted from participant to referenced subject within the file system. That transition was not spoken. It was executed through documentation hierarchy. I recorded that shift internally without reaction. Later analysis confirmed a structural break in the original assumption of singular control. A portion of the transactions under review had originated through an external consulting platform, not a bank, not a direct financial institution, a layer above standard visibility. Access had been routed through someone embedded in her professional environment. That detail expanded the structure outward in a direction that had not been considered before. It meant the system was not centralized around her. It had been distributed. That changed every earlier interpretation of intent. By late afternoon, I exited the courthouse alone. The movement outside continued normally. Cars leaving, foot traffic dispersing, people returning to unaffected timelines. There was no visible trace of what had just been reclassified inside. I walked without stopping until I reached the edge of the parking structure. There was no sense of resolution attached to the ruling, only adjustment. The legal framing had shifted, but the underlying structure remained partially unaccounted for. The divorce as a concept no longer held explanatory value. It had been replaced by something closer to a financial architecture under investigation conditions that had existed before visibility began. I reached my car and paused before entering. For the first time, the question was no longer what had been done. It was what had initiated the first movement in a chain that none of the current records could fully trace. The system had produced outcomes, but the origin point remained unassigned, and in that absence, the case was not closed. It was only quiet.